This is PTV World. I am SHABAHAT and you're watching Fault Lines. The problems between Russia and Ukraine are far from being over. Ukraine has struck back tremendously, not only on the diplomatic fronts, on the economic fronts, but as well as on the military fronts this time. Ukraine has successfully taken back 8,000 square kilometers of area in the eastern province of Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv was strategically an extremely important province. Not only that, the Ukrainian forces are now pushing further east in the province of Luhansk, and Russian military is taking the brutal onslaught by the Ukrainian military, which attacks are now far more formidable with the improved weapons given by the West, in particular the United States. On the diplomatic front, the United Nations General Assembly has allowed President Zelensky to speak to UNGA first time on a pre-recorded statement, which would be a surprise for many who initially thought that Zelensky will not be able to make it. Also, the fact that von der Leyen, who is president of European Commission, has given again sweeping statement. She has said that Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia are the countries without which the European Union is not complete, and these countries will eventually become a part of European Union. This unpleases Russia further, and now the pressure is on Russia because while the winters are approaching, Russia has already lost a lot on the battlefield as well as on the ground. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Russia-Ukraine crisis enters a dramatic phase as Ukraine has reclaimed 8,000 square kilometers of territory this month, according to media reports. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Izium days after his country's troops retook the city during an ongoing counter-offensive against Russian forces in the northeastern part of the country. Kremlin emphasized that Kiev's ongoing ambitions to join NATO still present a threat to Russia's security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stated that Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to believe he did not commit a mistake by launching an invasion of Ukraine after a 90-minute-long telephone call with the Russian president. As part of diplomatic efforts, former U.S. diplomat Bill Richardson visited Russia this week amid efforts to secure the release of American basketball player Brittany Griner and U.S. military veteran Paul Whelan. Democratic and Republican U.S. senators introduced legislation that would designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, a label opposed by President Joe Biden's administrations. Indicating silver lining in the dark clouds of the war, UN officials stated that efforts to revive Ukraine's agri-commodity exports have already helped stabilize prices of grains, cereals and oils, with nearly 3 million tons of cargo leaving Black Sea ports since the first successful shipment last month.
To talk more about it, and joining me from Cambridge University is my first guest in the program, Mr. James Carey, who is an expert of international affairs. James, I welcome you to the program. Now, first things first, James. Russian supply lines, as we were seeing a while ago, have been attacked by Ukraine. And this is not the first time. This is perhaps happening over and over. How do you look at this development?
Really interesting development, because what it highlights, what this change in tactic highlights, is that now Ukraine seems fundamentally secure about its own position. It seems able now to designate resources, military, civilian, and financial and food resources, towards not just defending its own territory where they're currently defending against Russian aggression, but they're also willing now to spend resources going after supply lines, which indicates quite a significant shift from just a defensive-minded approach to one in which they believe they are now able to relatively easily handle the Russian aggression, and instead start to find weaknesses in the Russian resourcing that will allow them to fundamentally undermine Russia's ability to re-resource its military units, which we know throughout this 6-month conflict has actually been one of the issues that Russia has faced regardless of this. So what this indicates is that there is potentially a movement towards Ukraine seeking an end to this military conflict, to this war, in a way that would favorably produce a favorable outcome for you.
It's very important to see that there are attacks now taking place on the nuclear power plants. Perhaps the reason is that the military is hiding inside the power plants, and they remember what had happened in 1986 in the city of Chernobyl, where a nuclear power plant was, became victim of something, and then the destruction was out of proportions. Now, how unfortunate is the use of nuclear power plants for hiring of forces?
That's a really good question. Fundamentally, at, at its base level, nuclear power plants are relatively unstable places to be. They're also relatively unstable places to attack. So if you are a Russian military unit who doesn't have much experience with Chernobyl, as an example, you might actually believe as an officer that it might be reasonable to hide both your men and your both your servicemen and women and your military capabilities um, inside the power plant, and also use it fundamentally as a base of operation because you know that it's relatively safe from missile attack from Ukraine. Um, there's also been reports of digging going on around in radioactive soil, which again probably illustrates that those doing that digging don't have much experience with radioactivity and don't know the risks that are fundamental to them doing that. So what this all indicates is that um, they're being thought of as strategic locations, which they very much are. Not only that, but not only as a base of operation or as a place to hide ammunition, but also as a strategic capability for its production of electricity. Um, let's not forget that these are actually places that do have a rather large impact upon Ukraine's ability to conduct a defense of its territory. So this is the reason why we're seeing so much to and fray over these relatively important strategic locations, because that's kind of exactly what they are. They are of high strategic value. But that nevertheless it doesn't preclude us from the fact that actually they can be extremely dangerous, um, and we have at different points throughout these last several months been relatively close to a pretty serious nuclear disaster, um, and that should worry everyone.
James, we will carry this wonderful conversation with you, but we'll have to take a break at the moment and join you back after the break. Stay with us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and we are carrying on the conversation that we were having with Mr. James Carey. James rightly pointed out, you said the use of a nuclear power plant is a bit unfortunate, and you said it is taking place perhaps because they are looking towards it as a shelter against the onslaught by the opposite army. But don't you think that Putin, as a matter of a strategy, is using electricity as a weapon as well? Because he primarily believes that electricity can be used as a weapon in the upcoming harsh winters, whereas gas is already being used or is being planned to be used as a weapon against Ukraine.
That's a very good point, and absolutely, I think that it's undeniable that what Vladimir Putin and high-ranking Russian officials now see as their best chance of gaining in this war is the effective holding of hostage of sources of energy. Now, to your point just there, these locations that are energy producers, they produce electricity for large parts of the Ukrainian economy and of domestic produce. They are of high strategic value, not just to Ukraine but also to Russia, in trying to suggest an end that is favorable. Additionally, we've seen Russia in the last 24 hours or so burning oil and burning gas on the Finnish border, on its border with Finland, illustrating that what they're clearly working towards is using their massive energy resources really as a way to keep Europe at the table. Now, this seems to be will be a problem that will only get worse for Europe, because as the weather changes, as we move towards the colder months in Europe, we are only going to see, firstly, the lack of energy become more and more of a problem, for firstly Eastern and then Central and then Western Europe. But we're also going to see the pressure ramp up on governments in Europe, one would imagine, to bring an end to this conflict in a way that would fundamentally allow them to go back to having secure energy production. We've seen the pressure on oil prices that has resulted in increased petrol prices across the world as a result of this conflict. We'll now start to see the same electricity price increases across Europe, that are effectively produced by this situation. Now, that all in all suggests that Russia has seen this as one of their greatest strategic advantages in this war, and in any warfare, you use your strategic advantages to your advantage, regardless of what it is. And this is fundamentally one that is legally usable by Russia in order to get an outcome that they desire. Whether or not that will enable them to win a war is doubtful, but it might actually produce a situation in which they can bring an end more favorably into Russia's territory. So it's a really interesting place to be in, and this pressure won't go away in the next several months, but we will start to see that taking a toll, perhaps upon intra-European, intra-EU relationships, and certainly upon Ukraine's population as well.
Carrie, the point is well taken. But tell me, there is an important element that we normally do not talk about, and it is a complete lack of strategic calculation on part of Russia. We understand that Russia was not anticipating to get into a long war like it did in case of Afghanistan when USSR was disintegrated. Now, there's a complete lack of progress on part of Russia if we don't talk about the gains made by Ukrainians. Don't you think this has risen the cost of war phenomenally for the Russian side?
That's a really good question, and I think these postmortems will be necessary, and will be done for years to come. And different people will come up with different answers, probably all of which, or most of the intelligent analyses of which, will be legitimate. I think from my point of view, there seems to be several factors that have worked together here, in order to produce the situation which we're in. Firstly, there seemed to be an overestimation of the Russian military's capability by the Russian military itself. The Russian military believed that they were more capable of pushing back the Ukrainian military from the eastern and northeastern lines that had been established, and also from the southern lines that had been established at the border with Crimea. And that just wasn't the case. Additionally, there seemed to be fundamental undermining of their military targets, both from a surveillance and intelligence point of view at the beginning of the war, all of which had led to an overestimation of their military capability. Secondly, I think there was a fundamental underestimation of Ukraine's military capability. Russia seemed to fundamentally underestimate the ability of the Ukrainian defense forces to defend their territory. And that's not an uncommon underestimation in warfare. That's a mistake that many different militaries have made and will continue to make, because there is an imbalance. There's an imbalance between defending one's country and attacking another's country. And fundamentally, this produces an imbalance in what you're willing to go to war for. Additionally, Ukraine has been fighting the Russian military in one capacity or another for a good 5 or 6 years now. And that means that there are battle-hardened units. There are units that have trained with Western militaries that are far more advanced and far more well-resourced than Russia's. And this all produces a situation in which the Ukrainian military stood up at the start of the war better than Russia thought it would, which then introduced a situation in which they could then start to reinforce their positions. And that actually takes me to, thirdly, The last point was that I think Russia underestimated the reinforcements that Ukraine would get from the West, primarily the European Union, the UK, and the US. Um, I think Russia fundamentally underestimated how much opposition there would be to this warfare, and also how quickly they would be able to muster really significant military aid to Ukraine, and also increases to their own defense budget. I mean, we've seen Germany increase the defense budget by 100 billion euros over the next coming years. We've seen UK send significant military hardware to Ukraine, as has the US, in a way that has enabled Ukraine to defend itself primarily and also secondarily from Russian attacks of all shapes and sizes as well. You know, of artillery, of small arms fire, of hand-to-hand and trench warfare combat. Ukraine has been able to put significant resources into all of their defenses against these types of warfare.
Gary, you have listed out a number of reasons, and let me repeat because your answer was slightly longer. You have said there were economic reasons, there were the reinforcements sent by Europe, the technology that has been brought in play by the West, and importantly, the diplomatic support that Ukraine has been gaining throughout the period of war. But if we compare the advantages, all these advantages together with the gains that they have made, we see that Ukraine's gains are not as big as the support was. So, and given the fact that Russia was in a very weak situation, as we have already pointed out, don't you believe that Ukraine has not been able to make a good gain or a good use of all these advantages as well?
That's a very good point as well. Is that whilst I'm listing off everything that Ukraine has done well, there hasn't yet been the decisive blow. But going back to the very earliest question that you raised, I think the targeting of supply lines now explicitly and implicitly, and the beginning of attacks behind the immediate enemy lines for Ukraine starts to illustrate that they are comfortable in their positioning on the battlefield, and they are able to extend that battlefield both longitudinally and latitudinally, so that they're creating a wider sphere of combat for Russia to defend. That seems to illustrate that we are getting to a point where they are comfortable with the defense they have, and they're willing to extend that further to begin to push the Russians back. Because as those units spread across the eastern line, the Russian units spread across the eastern line start to run out of provisions, whether that be food, whether that be clothing, whether that be oil or gas or military hardware, you will start to see those units collapse. And then you've created the distance between the front line and the available resourcing, which will then fundamentally push the Russian line back. That is what I would suggest is the way that this is going to begin to go next.
Kerry, do you actually find any room for diplomacy amid all of this that we have discussed thus far? Don't you think that the margin for diplomacy is narrowing with each tick of the clock?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point to raise, actually, because this is something that's changed significantly throughout the war. As Ukraine has become more comfortable and confident in its position, the messaging has become clearer and clearer that that we can't go back to the lines as they were on the 24th of January. We need to go back further than that. And that's kind of been echoed across Europe and by Biden in the US as well now, that effectively we need a total withdrawal of Russian forces from a pre-2016 Ukraine. And that is a really interesting change. That suggests that they are comfortable in their position, and or confident in their position. But what it also suggests is that they are starting to think about the things that will be negotiated with. So, with Ukraine seeking potentially to negotiate from a position of strength in any eventual diplomatic negotiation, they are clearly laying out their priorities, and they're clearly laying out the territory that they are seeking to either retain or regain from the Russian forces. And that will be a major diplomatic stumbling block for any potential solution, but not an unsurmountable one. These negotiations, how wars end, is a fundamental part of war. How the war actually ends is actually a really fundamental part, and it's always a toing and froing. But because they're not currently negotiating, what that diplomatic solution looks like is difficult for anyone to tell at the moment.
Gary, if I understood you correctly, this all boils down to a conclusion that if the stalemate continues, as you pointed out, that Ukraine is getting increasingly comfortable with the situation between the two sides. So, can I conclude from whatever you said that if the situation continues in a state of stalemate, it is not at the benefit of Russia?
That's a really good point. And I think that's something necessary to say is that it might well be that I've heard conjecture from different places that Russia is setting up for a winter in which they aren't going to gain and nor lose territory, and instead what they're going to do is they're going to ride that out to the point where they can remove their military hardware after a negotiated solution at the same point next year at which they drove into Ukraine. Whilst that is conjecture that I've heard, and I don't put my name to that, it does suggest that there will be an end to this. What it also does is it illustrates the sheer fundamental toll that this war has taken on not just Russian military, but on the Russian economy writ large. We've seen a large withdrawal of Western brands of manufacturing from Russia that will have a significant impact upon Russia's economy for years to come. Their recent default illustrates that their economy is not functioning as well as it fundamentally could be, especially given the resources they have at their disposal. How long this continues, though, will be the question. Going back to earlier, how this war ends and what the EU and the UK decide to do about buying Russian gas or oil into the future is actually a really interesting and fundamental question to what the effects will be on Russia long term. Because if we go back to a status quo and Europe begins to buy Russian oil and gas in the medium to long term, like they were before this war, then it might well be that there won't be as significant an outcome on the Russian economy as there otherwise might be were Europe to say, no, that's it, we're not going to reopen pipelines even after the withdrawal from Ukraine. So all these questions remain, and realistically, we're not going to know how affected the Russian economy is until well after this war is completed. One thing we can say for certain is that the Russian military has been fundamentally undermined by this war, and this will have strategic consequences worldwide.
Kerry, this was a wonderful point. Mostly you were covering the economic aspect of it, which is commendable. But there is a political cost for President Putin as well. And what do you think this cost will be if the mission Ukraine does not end up the way President Putin might have thought before initiating this initiative?
Yeah, this is also a really interesting point. How much power Putin loses in this war is an interesting question. My initial take on where we're at the moment is that were this to end in a relatively in a position that is similar to where we are now, the effects on Vladimir Putin's ability to run Russia and continue with the same sorts of power that he has concentrated into himself, into his office, will not be fundamentally undermined. I think Putin primarily, were things to stay relatively as comfortable as they are now, will remain quite popular in the Russian populations. We see in poll after poll, especially just outside the major cities, that Vladimir Putin is an extremely popular president, extremely popular amongst the Russian population, and whilst that may be tarnished slightly by this war, I don't believe it seemingly will be enough to oust Putin immediately or undermine his position in the near term. Um, However, were the Russian economy and were the Russian military to be fundamentally undermined by this exercise, there might well be the case in which Vladimir Putin is more politically undermined than otherwise at
Thank you
present.
very much, James Carey from Cambridge University, for being guest in our program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. James Carey, and he has pointed out a number of reasons why Ukraine has not been able to end it so far and why Russia has not been able to capitalize on the weaknesses demonstrated by the Ukrainian sides. But in any case, as he has said, and as many other experts are independently commenting as well, that the war is not to go away soon from this region. It's a matter of survival for Russia, it's a matter of survival for Ukraine. Russia has a lot of support of her natural resources, and Ukraine has a lot of support from the West. Ladies and gentlemen, the second topic of today's program is about the floods, as we have been talking about the floods since the flash floods, the super floods of 2022 have hit Pakistan catastrophically in the last week of August. These floods have damaged Pakistan's infrastructure to a remarkable extent. And primarily the problem that Pakistan is facing today are two in nature. One is the damages of the infrastructure that has created a lot of economic vacuum, which we don't have resources for. And the other is the problems that are coming out of the water that is now stagnant in various districts of Sindh and not allowing the government to have an access to all these places. To talk more about it, I have today invited Mr. Abdullah, who is Mr. Mohammed Abdullah. He is a water scientist and expert of flood risk management, works for UNESCO. Abdullah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
We're talking about the water crisis when it comes to the flood. Now, how important of a role has the bad management or lack of management or absence of a comprehensive water policy has taken or has been blamed for the catastrophe that we are facing today?
I think more than climate change, it's about the management that we are lacking, and of course, the major impact on the current flooding of Pakistan. Because if you look back in 2010, one third of the country was underwater, and if we are claiming that we weren't ready how to tackle this flood, I think we had 12 years because it happened in 2010 and now in 2020, 22. So it is lack of management, and it's the 25th mega flood in the 75 years history of Pakistan. So it's like we have a one mega flood after every 3 years. So it shows our lack of seriousness and lack of management towards that. We are more concerned about the relief work every time when the flood comes instead of being proactive and managing the things beforehand. But we are lacking that. One good example would be that all those illegal constructions, those hotels that were there in Sawat, those some of those hotels were actually destroyed in the previous flooding, but then those guys rebuilt those hotels in the same place, which is actually illegal to build there because it's the riverbed. But the administration was sleeping, I would say, and now everybody just uh, wake up and they're talking about, okay, we're gonna take actions against even those hotels which aren't being destroyed by the floods, but they will be demolished by the government as they're sitting in the riverbed. And I think there's a rule in KPK up to 200 meters across the riverbed, you cannot build any house or any kind of infrastructure.
Abdullah, we have recorded a complete show in Swat, and we were told by the water experts there that on that day, that was I think 26th of August or 27th, if I'm mistaken, the water discharge rate was 11 times. 11 times of the regular flow of the river. Now, do we have a system that can anticipate such an exaggerated or such an unprecedented discharge in the rivers, which certainly would bring havoc in any part of the world?
Uh, we do not have, unfortunately, that system in Pakistan, but the world has it, and it is not so difficult to have it. It's called flood risk modeling or the climate change model. Because just like four seasons, there are not actually four, there are five seasons. Flooding is a season two. When I was at UNESCO, the first thing I was taught was they're not just summer, winter, and spring, autumn, but there's the fifth one that is flood. So if the river isn't flowing to its full maximum capacity of flooding, it doesn't mean that the area that you're sitting in belongs to you. No, it belongs to the river, and we have to give it open green space. So, like you mentioned, it was 11 times. It could be 11 times, or it could be 15 times because it's its place, and we have to give it its space. You can read about Room for River, which is a Dutch technology, and they have been in 1990 they got flooded heavily, and their houses were full of water, and they found out basically that they're sitting on the riverbed, and they had to give them a bit more space. And the thing that you asked me basically is that we need to do flood risk modeling, and how we do that is basically you collect data of the past 50 years, could be 100 years, and then you train the data, you validate it, and then it can tell you what mega events will happen in the next 5 years, next 10 years, 50 years, and 100 years. So this is called forecasting, and then you map all that on the QGIS, which is a free software. This is what the first world countries are doing, and that's why they are really, really safe as compared to Pakistan or other third world countries. So they already know what's about to happen for the next 100 years. So if we have that instead of just looking at the gauges, what we are doing right now is not forecasting, it's called nowcasting. The water is passing by, and then you go and you see what's the level of the water at that specific barrage and the gauge. It's not called prediction. We need latest technology. Just like in today's world, you cannot use Nokia 3310 to communicate, and the world is using smartphones for WhatsApp and for Facebook, Instagram. It's the online world. Just like that, we need to update our technology when it comes to flood risk modeling, flood risk management. We need to update our forecasting. We need Sparko to share satellite data with the scientists and with the engineers so that they can work effectively. I see NASA sharing pictures of Pakistan. I wonder why not our own satellite agency would do that and prepare everything beforehand. So I think if we use those models, which is not expensive, the only thing we need is to collect data. And if Sparko is willing to help us, we can collect all this data online, and I think we can, within a span of a year, we can map the country for the next 100 year, and then the next step would be those mitigation measures and what
Mr.
should be
Abdullah,
done.
don't you think that the lack of interest in building dams that could actually store this water uh, is a real reason why all this water is causing destruction? In many of the neighboring countries,
So,
there have been similar rains, but they haven't caused as much destruction as they have caused in Pakistan.
no, actually, this is an outdated technology. It's a myth that the dams would save us because the rain was in Sindh and in Balochistan. Tell me, if you build a dam on the Indus River or in Gilgit-Baltistan, how is going to save Sindh? The amount of water in the Sindh is 80 billion cubic meter. How are you supposed to save that? And also, if we build the dam, the groundwater level in every city in Pakistan is decreasing day by day. I think we all in Pakistan use groundwater, our own pumps, to use water. We have nothing to do with the dams. It's only for agriculture, and dams do not save us from floods. It's an outdated technology. You can go to American River's website and you will find out they have dismantled 1,797 dams, and just in the year 1990 to 2015, they have dismantled, I think, 900 dams in just 25 years. The reason is because when you build those dams, uh, they have those sands and silts and clay coming out with them. So if it says like it's 100-meter, and then there's a silting, those minerals is up to 40 meters. So your capacity is basically 60 meters. 40% is just wasted. But the hydraulic jump is 100 meters, and you have to open all your gates to save those dam
But
walls
by
and all those
opening
structures.
these gates, we didn't just let all the water go ahead. We stored as much as we could and let the excessive water go. And certainly dams like
There's
Mangla and Tarbela have
great.
stored a lot of water.
There's a better way of storage. That's what I'm telling you. How are you supposed to build a dam in Sindh and storing it? Do you have an idea about it? No, you cannot. There's no mountains. There's no hill. It's just a land. It's just a barren land. There are deserts, and it's just like a totally straight land. How will you build a dam there? So let me tell you what you should do, or what you can actually see from example. You go to the internet, you watch, you write actually Netherlands. flood storage, and you will find out there is no hydro dams in the Netherlands. They store all the water into the ground. So it is a very cheaper and better way to store each and every single drop of water into that region. I'm not telling you not to store water. Of
Build
course, we
dams.
have to store water. No, 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 don't build dams. You don't need to build dams. There are effective and cheaper ways to store water. Let me tell you how. So if there was a rain in Sindh or in the Balochistan, so what you do, you have those big channels like in the Netherlands. It rains 155 days out of 365. They have no storage dams. They collect all the water into the canals. It's not for beauty. And then they break the pressure of the water. They move them all around their country. And then they have a few ponds where they collect all the water. It takes 90 days to clean all the water, and then they drill it directly into the ground. And their groundwater level is 1 meter to 20-meter maximum. So if all that 80 billion cubic meter water that we have in the Sindh, you cannot build a dam that big of the size of a province where the population will go. So if we had all those drainages and those filtered uh, drainages in which we can just pump down all the water to the ground, it would have also helped raising the level of entire Sindh, especially Karachi, and it would have stored all the 80 billion cubic meter rainwater into the Sindh. It's like, for example, in Lahore, if it's 400 feet from where we pump the water, from the same bore, instead of pumping it out, we put it down. So the water level will rise up. It might goes to 200 feet from 400, and you store all the water without taking loan from
Mr.
IMF or
Abdullah,
World Bank
let's
to
take it
have.
forward. We are facing some serious problem in the province of Sindh. We have not been able to take water out of the districts that are under the water since the last week of August or first week of September. Time is passing by. Government have tried everything. They have tried to cut the reservoirs. They have tried whatever was possible. Still, these areas are under the water. Not only that, there are waterborne diseases that are now playing havoc with the health of the people stuck. What should we have ideally done to take this water out, or what can we ideally do to take this water out of the areas of Sindh?
I think it's the same thing that I've just mentioned. Put a filter somewhere and drain it into the ground. That's the easiest way because the water is going down. It's not going down because, like I said, there's not so much gravity left. It's not the norm that the water is gonna just go down like a flash. So maybe they could do that, and otherwise we just have to wait. We cannot do anything because there are so many embankments. We have altered the natural aspects of the flowing river itself, and also the sewage system in the Sindh is unfortunately not as effective as it should have been because last week it was just 25 millimeter of rainfall. Can you imagine just 25 millimeter? And the entire city of Karachi was flooded again because all our drainages, sewages are blocked with those wastages. There's no proper waste management in the entire country, especially in that part of the country. So when your drainages are covered with filth, or people have illegally occupied those lands and built something there, so what do you expect? Where the water will go? If you take Islamabad as an example, the old sectors never get flooded because we see so much green spaces. The concept of a park is not for entertainment and to run around. It is actually to suck all the rainwater and recharge your ground. And there are so many drainages, Basati nalas in the old sectors, if you see yourself. But in the new ones, there's no one, that's why it always gets flooded. Like E11, it has been built on the land of the drainage, on the channel. So this is actually the case. Same in the drainages are not built properly. There was no proper plan. There was no hydrological studies carried out like they were carried out for the old Islamabad. And illegal occupation has caused this. And now we just have to wait. We cannot do
Thank you
anything.
very much. Thank you very much, Abdullah, for being guest in my program today.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. Muhammad Abdullah, and what he said in the end was very interesting. All we need to do to come out of such problems in future is to plan the water management in a better way without planning water under a holistic policy that covers all eventualities like happened in the form of the recent floods, we can never come out of the crisis that we are facing. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.